y'all, welcome back to Homemade Simple. If we've not met before, I'm Lori. I'm really glad that you're here today. I've been excited about sharing this video with y'all for quite a while, and I'm really looking forward to being able to share with y'all a simple and easy method to create and keep up your own sourdough starter so that you can have that nutritious food ingredient in your kitchen all year long without any extra hassle or trouble. So today we're going to talk about how to create our own sourdough starter using only flour and water. We're going to talk about how to keep that starter alive and active, and also a couple of good ways that we can use that sourdough starter in order to increase the nutrient value of all of the baked goods that we feed our family. We're also going to talk about some of your questions about sourdough and also how to avoid some of the normal pitfalls that we experience when we are creating our own sourdough starter and trying to keep it alive. So first, let's get started talking about how to make our own sourdough starter without any specialized tools or equipment. Before we get into how to make our own sourdough starter, I want to answer two very important questions. Number one, what is sourdough? And number two, why should we incorporate it into our ingredients list for our baked goods? Sourdough, easily put, is just a fermented culture that uses the yeast in the air to create a natural leavener. Whenever this culture is growing and fermenting, it produces a lot of beneficial nutrients, vitamins, minerals, and probiotics that are all very beneficial for our bodies and the bodies of our growing children. Which really leads to answering the question, why should I spend my time creating my own sourdough starter and keeping it alive and using it in my regular baking activities? The culture that is created in the sourdough allows for a ton of vitamins and minerals and also probiotics to be easily accessed or bioavailable for our bodies to use during the digestion process. This is going to increase the nutrient value of any baked good that you make using your sourdough starter. Things like folate, niacin, B6, riboflavin, and thiamine are all very rich in sourdough starter. Also, minerals such as iron, magnesium, zinc, and potassium are all made easily accessible for our bodies whenever we add sourdough to our baked goods. But probably the biggest and most widely known benefit to using sourdough is the probiotics that it contains. There have been studies that show that if you suffer from any kind of gut issue, especially irritable bowel syndrome or Crohn's disease, sourdough is really beneficial in addressing the underlying issue, and it is very good at healing your stomach and gut. So there's a ton of great reasons why we should use sourdough and have it in our kitchen available for when we're baking. So why don't we use sourdough more regularly? I think it's because of the way that it's presented to be so complicated and hard to keep alive that people will try it and have to give up in the first 2 weeks because it's not working like it's supposed to, it's too complicated, and it's too difficult to keep up with. I have found a method that will erase all of those issues and make sourdough so simple that it just becomes a regular 2 or 3 minute part of your day. I can guarantee this to be true. If I can do anything in the kitchen, then you are going to be able to do it as well. I do not have any special skills or talents. I'm not a regimented person. I don't stick to a regular schedule. So I am very flighty about things that I do in the kitchen, and I'm not consistent at all. My sourdough starter stays alive, and it is very easy to rejuvenate even if it gets a little wilty or tired. So let's talk about the process of starting your own sourdough starter, the things that you're going to need in your kitchen, and the things that you're going to want to keep on hand to get your sourdough starter going and to keep it nice and happy. I think there are a lot of things that discourage people in getting a sourdough starter going and then also keeping it alive and active. And I think one of the things that makes sourdough so daunting is somebody telling you you have to measure the flour, you have to measure the water, you have to do everything precisely and exactly, and that this is more of a science instead of just a part of our kitchen routine. And if I was to think of sourdough as a science, I would give up on it and I would not be interested in it because I don't have time to be scientific about things that I do in my kitchen. I'm busy and I don't want to focus on my sourdough starter like it's another child. So what we're going to talk about today is a way to create your sourdough starter and keep it alive that is not going to require a lot of extra effort or trouble, and no weighing is involved. I'm going to first show you my sourdough. So this is my sourdough. I fed it this morning. It is not quite as bubbly as I would like for it to be, but it is on its way to being nice and ready to be used in a recipe. I'm going to show y'all in a little bit some of the ways that I use my sourdough on a regular basis, and by the time we get to that point in the video, my sourdough starter is going to be even more bubbly and risen and very ready to be used in a recipe. But let's talk about how to simply and easily get your sourdough starter going in your kitchen. The first thing you're going to need is a jar. You can choose whatever size or kind of jar you like. These mason jars work really well. How frequently you're going to use your sourdough and how large your family is going to be the main determining factor on how large your container needs to be when you begin. So if you use one of these mason jars, you'll also want a fabric napkin or a paper coffee filter and some kind of rubber band or string to allow you to cover the jar and make a seal that will prevent any kind of fruit flies or other insects or dust from getting into your sourdough. You can also use one of these lidded jars with the seal removed. You do not want to have a closed environment when you are working with sourdough. It is fermenting, which means that it's producing a lot of extra gas, and it's got to have somewhere for that gas to go. If you were to close up completely this jar or one of these jars, if you were to put a lid on it, the jar would explode and then you would have to start all over. So the benefit to this is you can latch it with the metal closure and then a bug is not going to be able to get through, but the gases and air that needs to escape will have plenty of room and will not cause any kind of explosion. Choose a jar out of your pantry. I'm sure you have one. It doesn't have to be anything special. Make sure that if you use a jar that was storing another food ingredient that you clean it very well, maybe even soak it in some vinegar. You don't want any kind of flavors or smells to permeate into your sourdough. So just go ahead and do that extra step and neutralizing any smell or flavor that might be in that jar. But it's perfectly fine to use an old pickle jar or something else that you have on hand. You do not have to go and buy a specialized jar. You're also going to need a wooden spoon for stirring and preparing your sourdough starter. You can use a metal spoon as long as it's stainless steel. The stainless steel will not interact with the fermentation process, but I find it just to be on the safer side to use a wooden spoon. Another thing just to be mindful of is making sure that the spoon that you choose to use is going to fit into the jar and all the way down to the bottom. So sometimes a wider mouthed spoon is difficult to get into all of the nooks and crannies in a particular jar, especially if there are edges and it's not a round jar. You can also use a silicone spatula, which will allow you to sort of scrape along the edges of your jar and keep it looking a little nicer and cleaner. My sourdough jar looks a little messy because I usually just use a wooden spoon, and so it will dry around the top edges of the jar and make it difficult to see inside and a little bit yuckier looking than if you were to use a spatula all of the time and keep it nice and cleaned off. You can also just periodically change your sourdough container and wash the one that you are currently using and then keep it rotating. You don't have to lose any of the sourdough starter itself. Just when you are discarding some of your sourdough, just go ahead and place the remainder in a different jar that's nice and clean, and then you can have 2 jars that you rotate. That will help it to be a little easier to deal with and reduce some of the stuck-on mess that you get when you're working with sourdough in a jar. And then you'll need a measuring cup. I normally use a 1/4 cup measuring cup whenever I am feeding my sourdough starter. We'll get to that in a minute. I have these wooden measuring cups. I really like them, but they are a little bit difficult in the maintenance department. If you leave your dishes in the sink of water and one of these is just in the water absorbing all of that extra moisture, it can warp them and cause a little bit of a trouble to get them nested back where they go. I also have these stainless steel measuring cups. I'm just using them to add the ingredients into the sourdough starter when I feed it, and not digging it in there and mixing it around, so it doesn't really come in contact with the sourdough starter itself. So even if these weren't stainless steel, maybe they were copper or something else, you can still use it to add in the ingredients to your sourdough. You just wouldn't want them to touch the sourdough starter itself. And believe it or not, that's all the equipment that you need. You need a jar, some type of covering, and some way to keep the covering on your jar, and then something to mix it with, and a measuring cup. That's all you need to start your own sourdough starter. I know that a lot of people say you have to measure things, you need to get a scale, you need to get this tool and that tool, and all of those things might be beneficial, but if you are looking for a simplified way to have sourdough in your kitchen without all of that extra stuff, you don't need it. You don't have to have all of the extra things that other people try to encourage you to get or try to sell you. We'll talk about some of the things that you need when you're creating your sourdough loaf. Those might be necessary, but even there, we can be very minimal in the things that we need to acquire in order to create our own sourdough recipes. So now that we've talked about the things that you need to have on hand to start your own sourdough starter, let's talk about how to make the sourdough starter itself. So the only two ingredients you need are flour and unchlorinated or dechlorinated water. That's it. The sourdough starter will use the yeast in the air to create the culture that it needs in order to grow and ferment. All you need to do is add together flour and water and consistently feed it the same ingredients every day or 2 days, and you will have a nice and healthy sourdough starter that you have done all on your own without any special or extra equipment. I like to use unbleached flour. I've talked about this in several other videos, and the reason that I like to do that is because there's a lot more nutrition available and also a lot more of the whole wheat available in an unbleached natural flour. King Arthur has a really good unbleached flour that is really good for creating your own sourdough. I got this from Costco. It is an organic, unbleached flour. It's really affordable. I also noticed that Sam's Club has its own organic flour that is unbleached as well. And Sam's also carries that King Arthur flour. You can use bleached flour. It might not do as well. It might not be as strong. But if you can only find enriched, bleached flour, it will still work, and you can use the same method that I'm going to teach you using this unbleached flour. You can also experiment with different kinds of flour. I've heard a lot of people like to start their sourdough starter with rye flour. It is a little bit more boosty to begin with, and so it will sort of take off a little bit quicker than regular wheat flour will. You can also use almond flour or the King Arthur 1-to-1 flour to create your own sourdough starter. It will not work quite the same as a yeast flour will, but it will still create a sourdough ferment that will be good to use in all of your baking. So if you have trouble with gluten, you can use that gluten-free flour and create your own. You don't have to be excluded. And speaking of gluten, another really good reason to start your own sourdough starter is because it really reduces the amount of gluten that is found in any baked good. Maybe you don't have celiac, but maybe you do have a little bit of a gluten sensitivity. Sourdough is a perfect answer for all of your stomach issues and all of the issues that might come from your gluten sensitivity, because it really reduces the amount of gluten in the finished product of a baked good like bread or crackers, and it's going to make it more digestible even if you do have gluten sensitivity issues. The only other ingredient you're going to need to create your sourdough starter is dechlorinated or unchlorinated water. Now, I don't have a well. If you have a well at home, you're not gonna have to be concerned about having chlorinated water. Yours is already naturally ready to go. But if you have city water and they add the chlorine to your tap water, it's very simple to dechlorinate your tap water. All you have to do is find a container that will allow for the chlorine to evaporate. As long as you give the water about an hour or so to evaporate the chlorine, you will be just fine. It's really better to not add tap water directly into your sourdough starter. There is a good chance that it will either damage or destroy your sourdough cultures, and you will have to begin the process all over again. So using dechlorinated water is simple, it's easy to do, it doesn't take a lot of extra time, and if you just have a small pitcher that you can leave on the counter beside your sourdough starter, it will be already dechlorinated and ready to go every single day. And those are the only two ingredients that you're going to need to start your own sourdough. You're going to need your jar, your spoon, your measuring cup, your flour, and your dechlorinated water. That's it. Now we're ready to start our own sourdough starter. Okay, I have chosen to use this lidded jar for my sourdough starter, but again, you can use just a regular mason jar and it will be just fine. The first thing we're going to do is add about 1 cup of regular unbleached flour. Again, if you don't have unbleached flour, it will work just fine to use the bleached and the enriched, but I just find that the unbleached has more nutrients available and makes a little bit of a better and more hearty starter. So what I try to do as a normal practice is add a little bit less water than I add flour. So I added 1 cup of flour. I'm going to add 2/3 cup of water. You can add 3/4 cup of water and 1 cup flour. It doesn't have to be perfect and it doesn't have to be an exact ratio. All we're looking for is the right consistency to allow the culture to feed and have plenty of food without being too dry and too wet. So now I'm just going to stir it together until I get as many of the clumps as I can out, but you will see that it's going to dissolve all of the clumps as it begins to ferment and feed. So you're not going to end up with a clumpy mess. It's going to be just fine even if there are a good number of clumps. So now we have our starter nice and incorporated. Make sure that you get around all of the edges. I just noticed that I had a big clump of dry flour that I could see on the outside of my jar. So you want to be sure and get all of the flour nice and incorporated into the water before you seal it up to ferment. As long as your fingers are clean, you can use it to scrape off the excess off of your spoon. Make sure that you immediately put your spoon into some water to make sure that it doesn't harden. This is a really difficult ingredient to get off of your utensils if you don't rinse it off immediately. So don't leave this and let it air dry and then try to get it clean, because it will be a nightmare. Now all we need to do is put on the lid, close it up, and allow this to sit. We're going to feed it every day. Regularly feeding your sourdough starter is very important. If your sourdough ever gets like a layer of liquid on the top of the sourdough starter itself, that is an indication that the sourdough is hungry and it needs to be fed, and it needs to be fed fairly quickly. Just like any other living organism, you have to have plenty of nutrients and nourishment in order to survive and to thrive. And so by you feeding your sourdough starter every single day, you're going to give it the kind of nutrients that it needs in order to survive, which is going to allow it to give all of the extra nutritional benefits to you and your family whenever you use it in your different baked goods. So let's talk about how to feed our sourdough starter. At the very beginning, you're not going to see a ton of bubbles. This will happen day 2 and 3, and maybe even up to day 14 or 15. You may just not see the kind of bubbles that you're expecting. That's okay. It doesn't mean that it's dead. It just means that the amount of yeast in the air in your home is not quite as large as the sourdough needs in order to bubble up quickly. Some of you, it will be very bubbly on day 3, and some of you, it will take quite a while for the sourdough to begin being very active. Doesn't mean you've done anything wrong. It just really all has to do with the air in your home. So let's go through the process of what you're going to do day 2, 3, and 4 until your sourdough is active and ready to use in a recipe. Until your sourdough starter begins to bubble and double in size after about an hour or 2 of feeding, you're not going to want to use it in any kind of bread recipe. So in order for you to feed the sourdough, you don't have to discard any. You can leave it in the jar and just add to what's there. If you do that, you're going to have to get a bigger and bigger and bigger jar. So that is the reason that people talk about sourdough discard. It's not because you have to discard it every single time in order for it to live. It's just because you're going to end up not having a jar large enough to be able to contain all of the sourdough starter that you are feeding. And if you never discarded any, it's just going to continue to grow and bubble, and it's going to get so big that even a gallon jar or a 2-gallon jar is not going to be big enough to hold it. Here's what we're going to do in order to keep our sourdough nice and alive and active without overtaking the entire house. Normally you'll want to discard about half of your sourdough starter. Again, this does not have to be perfect. This is just a simplified way to have your sourdough continue to be nice and active and healthy without having to have a lot of extra steps or specialized equipment. So we're going to discard half, and then we're going to feed it with, I'm going to say a half a cup is plenty for this size of a jar, and then I'm going to add just a little bit less water than I did flour. You can add the same amount to keep the math easy, but you might find that it's too runny if you add that much water. So you can just back it off or add as you see your starter needs. Every sourdough starter is going to be a little different, and that's what makes it so interesting. My sourdough is going to be a little bit different in makeup than yours is going to be, even though we might use the very same ingredients, and that is all because of the ingredients in the air that is going to feed our sourdough itself. So now I have fed it, and now your sourdough starter is ready to go to the corner of your kitchen, sit there, and grow into a delicious and nutritious food ingredient. Okay, now how often should you feed your starter? It depends completely on how you're going to use your starter. If you're going to bake a loaf of sourdough bread every single day, then you're going to want to keep it out on your counter, and you're going to want to feed it at least once a day. But if you are wanting to not have a lot of hassle and you don't want to have to keep up with your sourdough every single day, all you have to do after it's nice and bubbly and active, if you want to put it in the refrigerator to slow down the fermentation process, you can use your sourdough starter on a less frequent basis. It's not going to kill it, it's just going to slow it down to a very slow feeding schedule, so that if you want to bake bread on a Saturday, you'll pull it out on Friday morning, give it a good feed to rejuvenate the feeding process, and then by Saturday morning it should be ready to use in whatever recipe you want to use it in. So it's completely up to you how often you want to feed your sourdough starter. I keep mine on my counter because I am very likely to forget about it if I don't, and I want to use it and incorporate it into a lot of different recipes just in order to have more probiotics and more nutrients in the foods that I make for my family. If you don't bake a lot, and if you don't want to hassle with feeding your starter every single day, then putting it in the refrigerator is a really good way to go, and it's not going to damage it at all. And as an aside, I will say that the refrigerator is going to be your friend when it comes to having a little bit of your active sourdough starter stashed away in the back. It has saved me several times because I always make sure that I have a little bit of sourdough starter put away in the back of the refrigerator so that if I do get too busy and go too long without feeding my starter and I can't quickly get it back going like I want to, I can just bring that little jar. It only has to be about a quarter or a half a cup of sourdough starter. I bring that out and feed it, and it is amazing how quick it will become active and ready to use. It's a really good idea after your sourdough gets going and gets really good and active to just set a little bit aside just in case of an emergency where life gets too busy and you accidentally kill your sourdough starter. I'm not good at making just a regular sourdough loaf of bread look beautiful. And I know that you've all seen on Instagram and Pinterest how these people can take that little tool and make all of these beautiful decorations on the sourdough loaf, and that just makes me feel like a complete failure because there's no way I have the artistic ability to be able to make flowers in my sourdough. I mean, I'm doing good if I can do 2 lines that meet in the middle. So I'm not good at making a beautiful sourdough loaf. But what I am able to do on a regular basis is use my sourdough for not only bread, but also a lot of other recipes that's just going to boost the nutritional value of any kind of food item that I make in my kitchen that calls for flour and water. Any recipe that calls for flour and water, you can use your sourdough starter to increase the nutritional value of that recipe. I'm going to go over how to make a regular sourdough loaf, but I just want to say that if your family is not a huge fan of the chewy texture and the sour flavor of a regular sourdough loaf, it does not eliminate you from benefiting from sourdough starter itself. I also want to share with you a recipe for a soft sourdough loaf that is much like sandwich bread that you get at the store. It has a slight tang to it, but nothing that's really noticeable. And it's also very soft and easy to cut and easy to chew. So I think that recipe is probably my favorite way to use the sourdough, simply because my family enjoys eating it. If you go online and just search sourdough discard recipes, about 1.5 million will come up, and there's no way that you'll be able to go through all of the recipes. You can use it to make anything from cookies to pretzels, and they will all turn out delicious. So let's talk about how to use our sourdough starter in a few of those recipes. Since this is a sourdough recipe video, I'm going to start with just the basic sourdough bread recipe. I'm going to try to give you a good base to start with. So to put our dough together, I've got a small, I think this might be a 2-quart bowl, but it's a fairly small glass bowl. You don't need something huge. You don't need a lot of room. And it's gonna have simple ingredients. We have our sourdough that is nice and bubbly. This is what you want your sourdough to look like. I fed it this morning. It's been growing and fermenting and becoming more and more active through the day. So now it's ready to be used in our recipe. If it's not nice and bubbly, if it's not what we talked about earlier, being active and rising enough, if it's not that way, it's not ready to use, because this is what's going to cause the bread to rise. And you don't want a flat, hard piece of sourdough bread. It's just going to be discouraging. So when you have bubbles like this, you're ready to go. We're going to use 1 cup of our sourdough starter. Remember to try to avoid using metal if it's at all possible. You don't want to use any kind of metal unless it's stainless steel. And just to be safe, I try to just stay away from all metal altogether. The next thing I'm going to add is 1 1/2 cup of our dechlorinated or unchlorinated water. It's warmed up to about 100 to 105 degrees, and we're just going to gently pour that in and make a nice slurry. And then we're going to add 4 cups of our unbleached all-purpose flour. Our last ingredient is 2 teaspoons of salt. I use Himalayan salt. You can use whatever kind of salt. This just adds minerals to the sourdough itself. So that's why I choose to make that. Now we're just gonna try to combine the dry and the wet ingredients as much as we can. This is when your sourdough, being a little bit different than my sourdough, may cause you to need to change this a little bit. You might need more water, you might need less water, but we'll talk about the consistency that we need it to be, and then you can adjust your recipe as needed. This dough is going to be fairly sticky, so using your hands, it's going to cause you to get it all over your fingers. That's fine. Just make sure your hands are clean, and that will be absolutely okay. No worries. As you're mixing it with your hands, just sort of pull and fold over and over again to make sure that it's all nice and incorporated. If you were to try to knead this dough on the counter, it would stick to everything. That's the kind of consistency you're looking for. You're not looking for it to be soppy wet, but you're also wanting it to be sticky. And I think you can see how it's sort of sticking to my hands. And when I'm pulling it and pushing it down, it's a very sticky consistency. That's gonna give it the kind of moisture that it needs when you cook it. So make sure that it's not dry. So I'm just gonna keep pulling and folding it over, maybe for about 5 minutes or so. You don't have to do this step, but this is going to allow it to be very well combined and make sure that there's no dry spots of flour in there. And it's also going to incorporate a little bit extra air into the dough, which is going to give us a better end result. I've pulled and folded this dough for about 5 minutes or so. It's ready now for its long overnight rise. All we're gonna have to do is place it in our bowl, cover it with a tea towel or a dish towel, and allow it to sit in a warm environment, as warm as you can find, overnight for about 8 to 12 hours. A really good place for this to rise overnight would be in the oven with the light on. That will give it just enough warmth to have a really good warm environment without it being too hot for it and causing it to rise and then drop. So I'm going to allow this to rise overnight, and then in the morning we'll talk about what to do next. Okay, it is the next day. My sourdough has been rising all through the night, and so let's see what we have now. So you can see that it has at least doubled in size, so we are on the right track. Your sourdough should have at least grown and risen some overnight. If not, it's okay. It just means your sourdough wasn't quite active enough, and you can feed this to the birds. They will love it, and then you can start over once your sourdough starter is nice and bubbly and active. So I'm going to try to roll this up into a ball. I'm not trying to knead it or anything. I'm just trying to make it into a smaller ball size so that it will be ready for the second rise. I'm gonna let this sit for about 10 minutes or so, and then I'm going to get it ready to go in the proofing basket. Okay, I sort of got busy putting the dishes in the dishwasher. This ended up resting for about 20 minutes or so, but the next step, we're going to put it in a proofing container. So we need to talk about what we're going to use. This is called a proofing basket. This is what most people use. You just flour it well, put the sourdough bread into it, and allow it to sit for about 2 to 3 hours until it has doubled in size again, and then you take it and invert it into your Dutch oven and bake it. So this is option number 1. It's called a proofing basket. I will link it down in the description below. It is a really good option. It is sort of hard to keep it clean. I'm sure I do something wrong to make it have all of this flour, extra flour in the bottom. It's hard to clean because it's wood and it can easily sort of get out of shape, and the water can damage it a little, so I don't wash it much, but it doesn't get dirty. It just gets flour on it and it's used for the same thing. So washing it is not a real big deal. But there's also another option that you probably have at home. Sorry for the noise. Lane is playing with his monster trucks. Your other option is just to use a regular bowl, a mixing bowl. And again, this is the 2-quart size bowl, and a regular like tea towel, or this is a fabric napkin. And what you'll do here is flour the napkin really well and place it inside the bowl. And this will make sort of a DIY proofing bowl where you don't have to buy anything extra. I'm sure most of us already have a mixing bowl and some kind of towel that we can use. So this is the way I'm going to do it. This is the way most people do it. So you get to choose whichever you want to do. I'm going to do it this way just to show you that it's possible and that you don't have to buy anything extra. Okay, so I'm going to set this aside, and I'm going to put a little bit of flour on our counter. You don't want to put a ton, just a little. And I'm going to pour this out onto the flour. I'm trying to sort of scrape the bottom of the bowl to preserve any kind of air bubbles that are in there. Now we're going to just roll it into a ball again. Yeah, you can get it. Trying to sort of get it all into a ball with a floured surface so that it's not going to stick. The purpose of this is to get it in the right shape for the proofing basket or bowl, and to get it to a point where when you place it in, it's not going to stick to anything. So this is what you're looking for, just a round ball with a little bit but not too much flour. And now we're going to take our towel. Again, this is a napkin, but I didn't really want to use like a thick terry cloth towel. I wanted to use a more cotton thin towel, so that's why I got a fabric napkin. And I'm just going to sprinkle some flour on this as well. The purpose of this is to try to keep it from sticking. If your sourdough sticks to the proofing basket, it messes up the end result. So you don't really want that. You want to try to keep it as non-stick as possible so that it won't damage the end result. This is going to be the side that is baked up and everybody's going to see. So we're going to try to keep it where it won't be damaged. Now we're going to take our sourdough and we're just going to invert it into our proofing basket. Now this is the time where you can just fold this over a little, not like squishing it in, but just to cover it so it doesn't dry out. And now we're going to set this in a warm environment for about 2 more hours and allow it to rise as much as it's going to. Then we will get our Dutch oven out and bake our sourdough loaf. So 2 hours and then it's go time. So now let's talk about our favorite sourdough bread recipe. This is a recipe that is not hard or chewy or extra sour. This is just a really nice soft loaf recipe that my family really likes, and it's really easy to put together. We're going to start with 1 cup of sourdough starter. We're going to add 3 cups of our flour. I add 1/4 cup of regular milk, but you can also add a 1/4 cup of dry milk powder. You can find that at Walmart. Very inexpensive. It's a really good thing to have on hand. 1/2 cup of water. I'm gonna add 2 teaspoons of salt. I like mine extra salty. I can't stand bread that does not have enough salt in it, so I just add a little bit extra. I'm gonna add 2 tablespoons of honey.
Yeah.
You can also add 2 tablespoons of sugar and 2 tablespoons of melted or softened butter. The last ingredient is 1 egg. Sometimes I add more eggs because we have a ton of eggs, but 1 is all it needs. Now this is a bread that we are gonna need, whereas we didn't want to need the sourdough loaf that we just made a moment ago. We do want to knead this bread, so we're gonna combine everything as well as we can, and we're gonna get it out on the counter. This to me combines the best of both scenarios of homemade bread and getting the health benefits of sourdough bread without it being difficult to eat and the flavor being a little off-putting to some. And this is also a really good alternative to just plain homemade bread. It has a nice flavor, it has a nice texture, and it also has a lot more available vitamins and nutrients. This is sticky, so it shouldn't be sticky. We're gonna have to knead in a lot of flour. We're gonna knead this until it is nice and slick and...
Me too.
Okay.
I have one.
You want me to give you some?
Yeah.
Here you go. And here's your pile. Until it's nice and shiny and sleek, just like a regular loaf of bread is. Notice we didn't put any yeast in this bread. Our sourdough is the leavening, which is not going to save a ton of money, but it does increase your sustainability in your own home, which I think is a really good thing, especially nowadays when it's more expensive to source things at the grocery store, and some things are getting to be a little more difficult to find. As long as you have access to flour, you can make this bread, and that's really good. I think this is a pretty good place to start. See, it's not sticky anymore. It's got a nice sheen to it. So we can put it back in our bowl. I am going to oil our bowl a little. I'm not going to take the extra step of washing it, but if I oil it and coat it with that oil, it won't stick. You probably really should wash it, but I'm trying to get things done. So now I'm just going to put it in here. I'm going to cover it with my towel, and I'm going to let it rise for about 3, maybe 4 hours. Okay, our sourdough loaf has been rising for about 3.5 hours now. Got a little bit sidetracked and busy, so we went past our 2 to 3 hour mark. That's okay. It just means that it'll be a little more sour and maybe have risen a little bit more. Probably hasn't risen much. So I have my oven preheating to 425 degrees Fahrenheit. Now, if you can get your oven to be a little bit hotter, maybe 450, that would be better. But my smoke alarms will go off if I have mine usually anywhere above 400. So I'm hoping that I can get by with the 425 and it not start blaring at me. But let me show you what to do at this point to get it ready to go into the oven. The first thing we're gonna do is get us a pretty large rectangle of parchment paper. Now we're going to get our loaf of bread, unfold it. You can see that it has risen a little, not a ton. It's okay, it's gonna be all right. Then we're gonna invert it onto our parchment paper. Flip it over. We can remove our bowl. And this is where we're gonna really hope that we've put enough flour to prevent it from sticking onto our fabric. This is the point at which, if you are at all artistic, you will want to use your artistic skills right here. I have 0, so what I'm just gonna do is just cut a couple of lines, and this is only to allow it to expand without having any kind of major issues on the loaf itself. It's gonna give it some growing room and some places for the gases to expand. So there is a reason for you to put some marks in your bread, for you to try to cut through that top layer that's a little harder, but it doesn't have to be beautiful. Now that I have gotten those small lines cut into my sourdough, I'm going to move this over and then pull in my Dutch oven. This is a 8-quart, I think, Dutch oven. You don't need it to be huge. It just needs a lid, and it needs to fit the size of loaf that you've made. So we're gonna grab all 4 corners of our parchment paper, and we're just gonna carefully lower it down. You're going to want to try to make everything as neat and comfortable for your loaf as you can. And we're going to bake this covered for 30 minutes. Then we're going to remove the lid, and we're going to bake it for another 15 to 20 minutes until it is nice and brown, but certainly not burnt. We're not going for a burnt loaf. Okay, it's all nice and brown and cooked through. I'm gonna let it cool just a little bit before I take it out of the Dutch oven, and then it will be ready to serve. Okay, let's cut it and see how it looks. It looks really nice, even though it doesn't have any beautiful designs. That doesn't really damage it at all. Let's cut a small piece and give it a try. There we go. You can see all of the nice air holes and bubbles in it. This is going to be a delicious afternoon snack, and it's perfect to go with a dinner salad or soup. It's perfect. Okay, now let's talk about our sourdough soft loaf recipe that I told you I like to make. I've let that rise for about 4 hours, and let me show you what's going on. So it hasn't really done much. It's done a little, nothing major substantial. This is pretty normal for this kind of bread. It doesn't really poof up like we would hope for it to, or like a regular yeast bread does. So this is about all we're gonna get from it. Let's go ahead and put it in our loaf pan and get it ready for the oven. I have a metal loaf pan. I bought a set of 4 of these at the thrift store. I'm afraid they might be like aluminum or something, which I don't really want to be cooking with, but I'm gonna use this anyway just because that's how I roll sometimes. I'm gonna use this loaf pan. You can also use a regular glass loaf pan, and that will work just fine as well. I'll link a couple different options for good loaf pans down in the description, and I'll be sure not to put one that's made out of aluminum. The first order of business is to get our loaf pan nice and oiled and ready. So I'm just gonna take a rag and spread some olive oil all around the bottom, sides, and edges of my loaf pan. Set that to the side, and now we can roll our dough out. Now, again, I wish this was bigger, and it's not, but it is pretty substantial. This probably is too big for this one. I want to make it sort of a high top loaf, so that's why I'm going to put it in this one loaf pan, but you can already see it's more than filling it up. So this is probably, I'm gonna probably regret this. It's gonna rise and be probably too big, but we shall see. I'm gonna cover this up, put it again in its warm environment, and let it rise for another hour or so. Then we'll put it in the oven and see how it turns out. Okay, my loaf bread is done. Now, it did not rise as much as I was hoping. I think this is probably a result of my sourdough starter needing to have been fed, and I didn't realize it, so it didn't have as much activity as I was hoping for. But whenever this cools, I'm going to get it out and slice it into small sandwich slices. And this is going to serve us for our lunches, and maybe even like we could have it for French toast or something like that. But this bread is always going to be soft. It's always going to be moist and a lot easier to eat with a sandwich as opposed to the traditional sourdough loaf that we made earlier today. I would highly recommend you giving this bread a try as well. I think you will really like it. It has certainly become one of my fast favorites. I really appreciated all of your questions that you asked about sourdough to help me create this video to be as helpful as possible for you. I think I have answered all of the questions that I received in the community page except for one, and that was a really good question about what to do if I have to go out of town. Is my sourdough starter going to die while I'm gone? And it's very easy to keep your sourdough starter healthy and alive even if you go out of town for a long period of time. And it goes back to refrigeration. If you can just slow down the process of the fermentation for your sourdough by putting it in the refrigerator, it will be healthy and safe for a very long time. Even if you leave it in there for a month or more, it will liven right back up when you take it out, feed it, and expose it to a warmer environment. So you're not stuck at home babysitting your sourdough starter. It will be very healthy and safe in your refrigerator, and you will be able to use it quickly as you return home from your vacation. I'll be sure and put a link to all of the items that I commonly use for my sourdough. I will leave those links down in the description box. But the good thing is there's no specialized equipment that you need to get started with your sourdough. I probably have not answered all of your questions in today's video. I would love to hear all of your thoughts and questions about sourdough down in the comments below. I try to answer all of those questions as quickly as I can. I, of course, am not an expert. I don't know everything there is to know about sourdough. If you were a little bit discouraged about sourdough at the beginning of this video, I hope that by now you have a lot of confidence and believe in yourself and know that you can do this too, that it's not hard, that it doesn't have to be complicated, and that it's very simple to keep it going in your kitchen without any extra effort. I will link my email down in the description box. If you need to reach out and get some extra help, I'll be happy to answer any questions you might have through email as well. Thank you so much for watching today. If you know anyone who is a little discouraged about sourdough and needs to know about how to simplify the process and have success without a lot of effort, please go ahead and share this video with them. And also, it would really help the video to reach more and more people if you will just go quickly give it a thumbs up. I really appreciate that support as well. If you haven't subscribed to the channel, I hope that you will do that. Be sure that when you click the bell icon, you choose all notifications so you don't miss a single video or post. Thank you so much for watching today. I hope you have a wonderful week. I love you, and I will see you again next time.